Paul has been arguing, and he can expand on this now, is that there's an enormous capacity among so-called, in quotes, marginal people to innovate and to solve solutions.
One of the issues here that we've not talked about is this is a political problem, because what you're calling marginality is often political opposition. And Jim Scott makes this point very well in his most recent book, which is about that area that links southwest China through mainland Southeast Asia, but the hill areas that you're talking about. These are not marginal peoples. These are people who've been driven out by metropolitan political processes in the great centres of power, and they've created an alternative world for themselves in the hills. Now the question is, what recognition do we give to them? Their stigmatisation as backward, ignorant peasants is part of the metropolitan discourse, because it would mean that there'd have to be a shift in the balance of power. If you were to give more recognition to the innovativeness of these people, it would also be like the Arab Spring. It would be giving power to the people. And this is a very present problem. It's a problem in China, it's a problem in the rest of Southeast Asia. And devising ways of trying to get governments to be more democratic about technology and to recognize the virtues of these so-called marginalized groups and to bring them into the mainstream of politics, because it actually pays to have democracy as well as democratic technology development. I think that's the big shift that we need to get involved in. And that means we need to change our conceptual models. It's the blinkers that we have that are really important here, rather than the capacities or lack of capacity of these so-called marginal people.
I think you mentioned about whether there's awareness about technology. Going back to Africa, there was a book published by Belgian Congo group when they were working in ENIAC, and there, Can Primitive Farming Be Modernized? Some of this technology we're talking about, conservation agriculture, the agroforestry, and other, this information exists. Tide ridges, for example. The first bulletin published from Tanganyika was 1942. I think that knowledge existed in journals and research articles, but I'm not sure it was translated into a system that policymakers and farmers could readily access to. Many times that information was created in the 40s and 50s probably by people who were working there but not of African origin. Therefore that knowledge really never got. So synthesizing the existing knowledge and also knowing why what we know is not being used, I think it's probably an issue which borders on social and cultural and political part, but there's a lot of knowledge about African soil that I do know exists, have not been used.
If you live in a village where the road is so poor that it gets washed away for 6 months of the year, you are really cut off. In a physical sense, you've been marginalized. And that is one of the biggest problems that Africa faces. Large areas of Africa don't have the connection to centres, small towns and so on.
I've had a couple of PhD projects where my West African students have looked at attempts to develop markets for seeds and other agro inputs, which have been either sponsored by the World Bank or have been direct entrepreneurial initiatives by international companies. What they've looked at is how well those have worked, because they're often embraced by governments under the general sort of liberalisation language of the last 20, 30 years, comparing that with what there is on the ground for those things. And in both the cases of both these studies, one was a study of oil palm seedlings, the other was a study of rice. But in both cases, the starting assumption of the donors and the national governments was there was nothing on the ground. And what my students did was to find that there was a great deal on the ground. And it was hugely important, and particularly it was often women that were involved in doing these entrepreneurial activities, and they were very entrepreneurial. They were pioneers of collecting new seeds. They had all sorts of technological problems that they faced germinating oil palm seedlings and getting them to grow, and they solved these problems and created effective trading opportunities for themselves. So the problem was that the best became the enemy of the good, because if you then say to a big international agribusiness, come into our country and take over the seed sector and show us how to run it, the first thing that they do is they simply undermine or destroy this local agency. So somehow we have to get better at recognising what is already there on the ground and what works. And the language of stigmatisation includes this very negative discourse, at least about Africa. In Africa, nothing works. It's all corruption, it's all violence. And in fact, there's a lot of things in Africa that do work, but we just don't have good documentation of them. So what we really need in that respect is a revival of the sort of social science that I think Gordon was referring to, or was it Dr. Lal, when he mentioned the famous study of the groundnut fiasco, and the similar book on the Nigerian version of that, the Mokwa scheme, which were very important pieces of documentation of why things were going wrong, and then you could actually see what there was on the ground and what worked and what didn't work. And we've tended to lose sight of those sorts of things because donors have said, no, we don't want social scientists and we don't want that kind of information any longer. It's good enough just to send the economists there and to look at the formal innovation structure or the formal marketing structure, and they forget about all this world of reality that actually is bubbling up from beneath and needs help and protection and improvement and so on. But you've got to start with what's there.